Okay, so welcome to Lecture 7, the last lecture that will be included on our midterm. We're beginning with our discussion of Alexander the Great. As I mentioned last time, Alexander the Great's story really begins with his father, Philip II of Macedon. Philip was the king of a kingdom, that's where Macedon is, slightly to the north of what we think of as mainland Greece. And politically, Macedon was quite different from what we found to the south. In the southern part, in the territory where Athens is, and in the territory that even further south in the Peloponnese, where Sparta is located, what we find is the kind of dominant political institution is the polis or city state. To the north in Macedon, it looks a bit more like the type of kingdom we saw described in the Iliad. There is a king, that's Philip at this moment, and he kind of rules sort of similarly to the kings that we read about in the Iliad. He's a war leader, and he has an alliance of other lords that serve him. Technically, he's the king and in charge of them, but in reality, realistically speaking, he has limited authority, typically speaking. This war leader that's described as the king does not have anything like absolute power. He can't just order people to do things and they do them. He's nothing like a pharaoh. Instead, he's the leader of other war leaders. So you could think of him as a really kind of a glorified warlord, leading a bunch of other warlords. Now, this begins to change under Philip II of Macedon. Philip begins consolidating power in Macedon. And he does it through a number of channels. Some of it luck, some of it very deliberately created by his own strategy. Some of that strategy was honed and refined during his youth. When he was a boy, Philip served some time as a political hostage in the city state of Thebes. This was a common enough practice in the ancient world. When treaties were arranged between two hostile countries that had had a problem with each other, in order to guarantee good behavior from a place where you weren't 100% sure you'd get good behavior, for instance, if, say, the city state of Thebes came to a contract with Macedon, what they would do is demand that there would be some kind of collateral. And the most effective collateral would be the children of nobles, the children of important people who were running the show. And so that's what happens to Philip in his youth. In order to guarantee his father's good behavior and to prevent his father from invading Thebes, Thebes demands that Philip be held and raised in his youth in the city state of Thebes, so that if the father ever steps out of line, the kid gets it. Now, this is a little bit of a tense situation, but as it usually goes, as long as things go well between the countries, this relationship does not have to be a negative one. Philip was raised with every courtesy and every respect paid to him while he was in Thebes, and that included receiving a military education directly from the sort of chief military commander in Thebes, Epaminondas. Epaminondas was the guy who'd been in charge of the sacred band. He was also the one who was doing all those really cool, innovative things, including using different military formations, not just the straight square phalanx. He also was using cavalry and longer spears. He was a military, I guess you could probably use the phrase genius. He was great at strategy and highly innovative. And it was down to Epaminondas that Thebes finally beat Sparta, which no one had done in forever and ever and ever. So Philip is raised in Thebes. He learns from Epaminondas, and he's going to take these skills with him when he goes back north to take charge of his kingdom. So, the strategy that he learns in Thebes is going to be one element of how Philip is going to consolidate control over Macedon. Another has to do with marriage alliances. He's going to enter into several of these. He's going to be a bit of a serial monogamist where he's going to marry one woman. A better deal will come along where he has a better political advantageous marriage to make, and he puts her aside and marries somebody else, which causes its own problems in his life. But one of those alliances he creates through marriage is with the city state, well, the region of Epirus, where he marries a princess by the name of Olympias and brings her into Macedon and sort of makes her his queen. She's going to be the mother of Alexander. Now, his habit, however, Philip's habit of kind of putting her aside and dallying with other women infuriates Olympias, and their relationship is not a pleasant one. They get into nasty knockdown, drag out, screaming matches in front of everybody. It's really kind of a drama filled thing where eventually Philip tries to put her aside, in part because Olympias begins spreading rumors almost immediately, partly driven by the fact that she doesn't get along well with Philip and wants to embarrass him, and partly due to the fact that she knows that she doesn't necessarily have Philip's affection secured, and she wants to make sure that her son, Alexander, is going to be named the heir to come after Philip. And so she begins circulating rumors while Philip is still alive that, in fact, her son Alexander was not fathered by the king, but rather by Zeus, who appeared to her in this vision dream during the night one night and impregnated her while Philip is lurking in the background. And Philip, of course, was not at all amused by this story. It's one thing to think that your son might have some kind of divine ancestry, or that you yourself might, but the fact that his wife was spreading this rumor around, making it sound like he was some kind of a divine cuckold and Zeus was out banging his chick, did not amuse Philip at all. And so at one point he calls her bluff and says, well, if Zeus is the kid's father, then I guess he's not my heir. And Olympias had to back down. Regardless, Philip engages in a bunch of these kind of diplomatic alliances in order to consolidate power. On top of that, he gets a lucky, and you might not think of it as luck, I suppose he gets an opportunity, we'll say that, in that while he is king and trying to secure the loyalty of those warlords that potentially can turn his kingdom from being a loose collection of relatively politically unimportant people into a more centralized kingdom with a king that has more direct authority, a group of people known as the Illyrians invade. Illyria is not marked on this map, but if you can see that reddish area where Macedon is marked and that kind of pale red that goes to the north, if you continue moving up the coast to the northwest, that is the region known as Illyria. And Illyria, relatively early on in Philip's rule, is going to invade Macedon. And he uses this, he takes advantage of this situation by using this invasion of hostile outsiders to rally his warlords all together to go and fight. And there's nothing like an invasion to get everybody on the home team on the same side. And then, once that happens, Philip's success is so dramatic. His military skill and strategy is so powerfully good and strong that they win one gloriously dramatic battle after another. They wipe the ground with the Illyrians, smash them to bits, gather up loot, conquer more territory. That's why there's darker red and paler red. They move the boundaries of Macedon further out. There's land to be handed out. There's loot to be handed out. His warlords are more loyal to him than ever before. And so he takes his large army and he leads them on this kind of basically epic conquest, where he goes from one region to the next, conquering more land, winning more loot, securing his army's loyalty even more firmly. Everybody wants to be on the winning side for the advantages it gives, and every time he wins a victory, Philip's rule becomes more secure. He can ask more of his followers that they are more loyal to him directly. He is going to cement and strengthen his rule. But that's not all he is going to do. Philip is also going to think not just about the next conquest, which we'll get to in just a moment. He's thinking long term as he's in the process of this move to conquer more land and consolidate his control. And part of how he thinks long term, we've alluded to a little bit last week. When he was choosing how to educate his son from that rocky relationship with the Princess of Epirus, Olympias, he's thinking long term. He doesn't want to just simply raise Alexander in Macedon among other Macedonians with Macedonian stuff, although he certainly does do that. He also wants to make sure that Alexander is going to have the option to move in the highest circles of Greek society, much like Philip himself after his experience being raised in Thebes. And so when he hires a tutor for his son, he hires arguably the most distinguished philosopher in all of Greece. He hires Aristotle to come and teach his son not just how to be a traditional Macedonian Homeric style warlord, but to also teach him how politics should work in the land of city states in Greece itself. He is putting some polish and sophistication on Alexander because even early on, Philip definitely had long-term ambition. And between 356 and 346 BC, he starts really implementing these ambitions. One region after another that borders Macedon is going to be conquered and brought into the fold. He's going to move to the south, partly at the instigation of a guy named Isocrates. We'll get to him in just a bit. He's going to move to the south. He's going to win some conquests. And he's going to threaten territory that's controlled by Athens and her allies. Ultimately, in fact, he's going to conquer one territory after another after another. He even sends threats to Sparta, which is in the southern part of Greece, on the southern part of the Peloponnese, which puts it in a very strategically defensible area because the Isthmus of Corinth is really, really narrow. And so if you can defend that pass, you can keep relatively large army out of the southern part of Greece pretty effectively. And so he threatens Sparta and suggests this is the famous conversation that happened between Philip of Macedon and the Spartans. While in the middle of conquering one swath of northern part of Greece after another, he sends a letter to Sparta that basically says, hey, maybe you want to join up. You want to be on my side. This is the time-honored way to get a big regional empire going, is you send out a bunch of ultimatums. Join us or die. And he sends this option to Sparta. You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city. The ephors, who are in charge of making political decisions in Sparta, respond very famously with a one-word letter. They just say, if. If you bring your armies into our land, you'll maybe have that experience, but we don't believe that. So this is where Sparta gets its sort of reputation. The word laconic in English, it's a little bit of a $10 vocabulary word. It refers to Lacedaemonian, which is a Spartan, if you remember from our Herodotus reading. And the word laconic means short, like if you answer kind of with a very brief one-word type of answers, you're laconic. At any rate, it's this kind of interaction, according to Plutarch, that gives Sparta that kind of reputation. At any rate, Philip is having all kinds of victories. He's winning land left and right. Then, in 338, he fights a very decisive battle at Chaeronea. And this is where he's going to lead the army against the allied forces of Athens and Thebes. They're making their stand, and they make a valiant effort to fight off Philip. But if you remember what's been happening before Philip invades, Thebes, Athens, and Sparta had been in that three-way war where they had just been bashing each other over and over and over again. And all three of them are in a seriously weakened state at this point. Their armies are diminished, and it's very hard to replace hoplite armies very quickly because you have to have somebody who has the equipment, you have to have somebody who has years of training. It's not something where you can just send some fresh recruits out overnight. So their armies are diminished, their money is diminished, they are not in any kind of position to fight back. And in 338 at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip is going to decisively defeat an alliance of both Athens and Thebes, crushes them. There's no question who is the victor. They surrender afterwards, and he offers them peace treaties. The peace treaty with Philip goes like this. He will allow them, because he's trying to butter them up, and create a large regional empire. And when you create a large regional empire, you're always very nice as you possibly can be to the newly defeated. If they fought you, they fought you. But once they surrender, you offer them the carrot to go with the stick. The stick is that you'll smash them with your army if they defy you. But the carrot, to sweeten the deal, you try to hold out so that they have some incentive to work with you. If you don't, and this is just a general observation, if you are brutal in your attempts to kind of enslave or otherwise brutalize newly captured people, it has risks. The risk being that if you show that you don't have anything to offer, if there's no possible light at the end of the tunnel, people have no incentive not to fight you to the last man, not to fight till the last person is dead. And that's not a good move if you're trying to establish an empire. You don't want people to fight you till every one of them is dead. You want people to fight you maybe a little bit token bit just to prove that you're stronger, but then you want them to surrender and stop causing you problems. So that's what Philip wants. So he offers them a deal. He's like, okay, so here's the deal. You can stay in charge of your own city states. That way you can save face. You can still have your assembly. You can still have the bull in Athens. You can still have if you were in Sparta, he's not dealing with Sparta, but you can still have the ephors, etc. You can run your city state however you want. But outside in your international dealings, if Athens wants to make a treaty with Thebes or Sparta or Persia or whomever else, all of your foreign policy has to go through me, Philip. I'm going to be in charge of that. I'll also, as a bonus, make sure that I defend you. So if anyone were to come and attack your territory, it will be me and my army who will come to your rescue. But what you give up is your ability to move independently in international circles. So run your city-state however you want, salvage your dignity, make yourself feel like maybe you haven't given up all that much. But you're going to have to pay me some tribute, which is we'll call it taxes. We're going to pay me some tribute. You're going to supply some of your soldiers to fight with my army, which only makes sense since I'm defending your territory now. And any kind of foreign policy decisions have to be run through me. You can't make those on your own anymore. That's the deal. It's a pretty sweet deal. The sacred band was destroyed after the Battle of Chaeronea, and there's a moment in Plutarch, who writes the life of Alexander much after his death, where he talks about the manly tear that Alexander sheds when he finds out the sacred band is destroyed. Because he's like, oh, what a shame. They were such excellent fighters. At any rate, Alexander is along with his father on this expedition. He's in his late teens, but he gets to observe how this battle goes down. He gets some in the field training as to how to fight and motivate his troops. He gets to observe the strategy that his father uses. He's really well educated at this point in military matters as well as by his tutors. Then, in 336, just a couple years after the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip is assassinated. Now, he'd been in the middle of creating grand plans because really his political strength revolved around the fact that he kept his army together. And he kept his army together, cobbled together of those Macedonian warlords and now troops from Athens and Thebes and various other parts of northern Greece. He kept his army together because he always had something to offer them, another task, another place they could go and conquer, and loot they could bring back as reward. And so everybody wanted to stay with the army and stay on his team because they were winning. And so once he had won the Battle of Chaeronea and he is controlling all of northern Greece, he doesn't, by the way, decide to go further south and take over Sparta. He figures it's too much trouble at this point. Afterwards, however, he's got to decide what does he want to do next. And this is where he considers going south and taking over Sparta more seriously. But in the end, he's like, you know what? The deal with Sparta is they don't leave the Peloponnesian Peninsula. They're stuck there because of the Helots, so we really don't have to conquer them. We'll just cut them off by controlling Corinth, which is that narrowest part of the isthmus there. And they'll just stay in the Peloponnesian Peninsula and not bother us, and so we'll just not worry about them. That's what ultimately they decide to do, because they figure, and this is something that Philip figures, that the real money the real benefit, the bonus in conquest is going to be to the north. He's going to move to the north of Macedon toward where the Straits of the Bosporus are, the modern city of Istanbul. It used to be Byzantium once upon a time. And he figures he'll just move northward, conquer that territory, bring it into his empire, and benefit from it that way. While he's in the middle of making these plans, however, he's assassinated. And this is like an in house thing. He was in his own palace. He was assassinated by one of his bodyguards. There are all these rumors that begin flying immediately over who killed Philip and why. Some people argue that it was because the bodyguard was, in fact, acting on behalf of Philip's ex-lover, who is the bodyguard's new lover. So it was all just a love triangle personal thing. Some people argue, however, and there are whispers almost immediately, that in fact Alexander, who's about 20 at this point, had gotten impatient waiting to take over the throne, or that Alexander's mother felt increasingly threatened by the fact that Philip had remarried and had a son with the new wife, and she didn't want that kid to get any older before the throne passed over to his heir Alexander. So nobody's really clear, but there definitely talk about the fact that Philip may have been assassinated by his own family. Now, because of this, people in Greece immediately begin speculating. They start thinking maybe now is the time to take action. Maybe now is the moment. Okay, so there's two schools of thought that were knocking around Athens prior to, there's more than two, but in the two we're going to talk about, knocking around Athens prior to Philip's invasion. One is espoused by a guy named Isocrates. It's spelled just like Socrates, but with an I. He's not related to Socrates in any way. It's just a coincidence. And Isocrates works as a speechwriter. That's his job. It's a relatively a prestigious job for people who live in Athens. Demosthenes, who we'll also talk about, is also a speechwriter. That's part of how he makes a living. And it's a necessary one because everybody is required to speak for themselves. So if you get called up to speak in your defense in a court case, or if you want to convince the assembly to do something, you have to give a speech on your own. But not everybody is good at persuasive speeches, and so you could hire a speech writer to make that argument for you. So that's what Isocrates does for a living. And he's going to witness this political situation in Greece where people are fighting constantly. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, bashing each other into the dirt. And at the end of this process, every one of them is weakened. Every one of them is impoverished. And Isocrates puts forward an idea and makes a speech about it, arguing that the Greeks are shooting themselves in the foot. That instead of having all of these city-states fight each other, they should band together and unite, an idea known as Pan-Hellenism. And that if they could just do that, they could conquer the world, because look at how powerful they are. Look at how strong they are, even when with all of this infighting. And so Isocrates looks around and he looks for a hero. Who could possibly unite all of the Greeks in one? And he flirts with a few other figures, but ultimately he lands on a guy named Philip of Macedon. So he's going to send a letter to Philip, who was in the middle, as we mentioned, of consolidating his own empire in Macedon. And Isocrates suggests, hey, maybe you would like to think about coming south to Greece. Now, this idea, as you can imagine, was not universally popular, and there was another speechwriter named Demosthenes who was so infuriated by the very idea that he begins writing a whole series of angry rants about Philip of Macedon, how horrible the guy is, how horrible it would be for Athens if they were conquered by a tyrant and lost their democracy, and instead were just ruled by this king that tried to boss them around all the time. And he gives these very impassioned speeches about what a terrible thing that would be for Athens, for Greece, for the world. He's so vehement that this particular speech style it becomes a name. It's another one of those $10 vocabulary words, but a philippic is an angry rant. It's an angry political rant of a speech or a piece of writing. So this is just, it may come up at some point in your life. It is an election year, so this is the year you could possibly pull that one out in conversation. If you ever want to seem smart to somebody and they're going on about someone in a way that perhaps is tiresome at dinner, going on and on about some political figure they don't like, you can dismiss them by interrupting by saying, that is nothing but a lot of lousy Philippic, and then just refusing to talk about it after that. You'll look very smart, and everyone will be impressed by your vocabulary. One hopes. Okay, so once Philip is dead, there's all this uproar. Alexander is not expected to be able to move very quickly. Everyone thinks there's going to be a moment of weakness. And so Athens and Thebes, who have only 2 years ago accepted that treaty after the Battle of Chaeronea, immediately rebel. They're like, we don't want to live with this anymore. We're not going to obey Macedon now that Philip is gone. Yeah, we surrendered to Philip, but he's dead. And so without his military genius, surely now is the chance to push back for our own independence. This is the kind of move Athens had done, for instance, many times. When they lost the Peloponnesian War and Sparta put the 30 tyrants in place, the 30 tyrants last less than a year before Athens overthrows them and goes back to what they were doing before. Athens thinks they're going to get away with the same thing this time, but they are wrong. Alexander comes out of Macedon at a speed they had not even dreamed was possible. He rallies his army and he marches to the south. This is part 2 of establishing and maintaining a large regional empire. You're kind to those you conquer. You're gracious to those who surrender and want to be part of the empire. You cut them a good deal. You honor your promises. You make sure that there's incentive for them to do as you say so that they have benefits as well as costs. But if anybody rebels against you, this you cannot tolerate as a ruler. This is how chaos and disorder arises. And so, when Athens and Thebes rebel, Alexander pulls his army together and he marches to the south much more, in much more force than they anticipated. And he utterly is going to crush every piece of opposition in his way. He was 20 years old and they didn't see this coming. They really didn't. But in 335, Alexander is going to encounter the army of Thebes and he utterly destroys it. Not only does he destroy the army, killing basically all of their fighting men, but he destroys the city as well. That's what it means to raze the city. He sets basically the whole thing on fire, smashes down any defenses or walls, and captures everybody who hasn't had the good sense to flee, and basically rallies them up into slavery, is what's going to happen to them after that. He does spare the house of the poet Pindar, because Alexander was highly educated by a philosopher into appreciating the finer things in life, including arts and letters. And even though Pindar had been dead for years, his house was preserved as a monument to him, and the rest of Thebes utterly destroyed, not one stone on another. The harshest possible terms is how Alexander responds to their rebellion. Then he marches toward Athens. Athens doesn't wait for him to get all the way to the city. They immediately surrender. They roll over like a dog and are like, oh, no, 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 we're sorry that we suggested that we wouldn't be part of your empire anymore. We take it all back. You can be the emperor and we will do what you say. It'll be fine. Go right ahead. Take our guys for your army. It'll be fine. So, having secured his hold on Greece again, Alexander is in the same position that Philip was in. He's like, what am I going to do now? My army is loyal to me. I've had brilliant victories. There's been lots of loot to be handed out. But I need some other goal. Otherwise, they're going to drift off back home and not listen to me. And I really don't want that this early on in my reign. I want to keep everybody going so that I can really cement these alliances and gather more territory. And I think we have to move on. I need somewhere else to conquer. And since I've got pretty good control over Greece at this point, I'm going to contemplate the same options my father had. And I'm going to come to the same conclusion about Sparta. We're like, we'll just keep Sparta. It's a risk-reward thing with Sparta, and it's a lot of risk for not necessarily all that much reward, so we'll just keep them bottled up. If I'm not going to go after Sparta, though, where can I go? Okay, so this is one of those rare moments, historically speaking, where a single person's uh, just idiosyncratic, which is another $10 vocabulary word, just meaning it's his own random idea. It's his own idiosyncratic idea is going to alter the course of history in a substantial way. Every time up to this, we can talk about, sort of grand trends. The development of hoplite warfare, allowing the spread of Greek colony cities, that kind of thing. And even wars. You can see the sort of buildup of military power between Athens and Sparta and like hostilities that build and build and build. And you're like, yeah, they're going to have a war. This is one of those really random moments. It was clear Alexander was going to attack somewhere. I would probably have thought Illyria. But what he does is he makes this incredibly ambitious plan. He decides that since Greece has fallen pretty easily to his attempts to pacify them, the next logical place to take on, if once you've beaten Greece, would be to go after Persia. Now, as you can see from the map, the Persian Empire at this time is enormous. It's staggeringly large. The little green area over there is Greece, and the Persian Empire includes all of the territory, what is now Turkey, the entire coast of the eastern Mediterranean down to Egypt. Egypt was all controlled by the Persian Empire at this point. It goes eastward through Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran, into Parthia and Bactria, all the way to the borders of India in the Himalayas. So it is this just unbelievably massive territorial empire. The odds that Alexander from Macedon is going to conquer this are laughably small. It's ridiculous. It isn't anything that any logical person should have thought they could do. But Alexander's like, I'm going to do it. And so he decides. And so he takes his army of various Greeks together and marches across the Straits of the Bosporus. I'm not sure how he gets them across, but he marches them across the Straits of the Bosporus and into Persian territory and engages the armies of the Persian king. Now, Alexander has some advantages here. He does have, despite his evidently very rash behavior, he does have experience, militarily speaking. He is a good strategist, a very good strategist, in fact. He's excellent at using those maneuvers that his father Philip had learned in Thebes and built on from there, using the hoplite phalanx in new and innovative ways in formations that were not purely squares, but instead in different shapes in order to manipulate his enemy. He's understands the advantage of having superior armor and weaponry, the way the Greeks have for years and years and years. He also understands this innovative use of cavalry, which he makes incredibly good use of. He is a great military commander. There is no arguing with that. He also has on his side a really highly developed way of manipulating his own image, his own persona, in such a way as to inspire the loyalty of his followers. Alexander, remember, had this education, or he grows up in Macedon, where the politics are much more like what you find in the Iliad, where you have a king who is a war leader leading other war leaders. At the same time, you have a guy who has grown up learning from philosophers like Aristotle and learning the value of rational thought and making decisions without letting your emotion affect things too much. Very opposite each other if you think about it. And Alexander attempts to reconcile those two things. And one of the ways he does this is by embracing kind of both sides of that. He's going to travel with not Aristotle, who's elderly at this point and retired, but he's going to travel with philosophers. He's going to travel with people who will observe things like the flora and fauna, the various plants and animals that he encounters, and make records of them. He's going to very carefully and scientifically observe what kinds of political institutions he encounters and understand whether it's a good or a bad thing. He's going to try to do his best to make very rational decisions. He's also famous, and this is part of the legend that will emerge about him, for sleeping with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. which is really quite remarkable when you consider that the book, the codex, which is what you call the actual physical shape of a book, where it's bound on one side and has pages and covers and that kind of thing, really was not in use at this time. And so, if you have something the length of the Iliad, it's all on scrolls, several scrolls. And so, for him to sleep with several scrolls under his pillow, they had to be kept in a box, very likely. And that's what it would have looked like. That's what those center pictures are. So, I'm not entirely sure how he arranged this, but according to legend, he slept with the Iliad under his pillow and modeled himself on Achilles, the great hero. He certainly did everything in his power to try to communicate that he had absorbed the moral lessons of the Iliad when he dealt with his troops. He was very famous, for instance, in fighting in the front in battle, in actually taking active part, conveying that notion of arete, that he deserved his place as the leader of men because he took equal part or the greater part in risking himself in order to fight valiantly. He also was famous for his generosity. So he's the opposite of Agamemnon. When they capture loot, he gives it out with very open handed ease. He gives it out to everyone. And according to Plutarch, there was a moment where Alexander had conquered something and he'd gotten all of this loot and he was handing it out to his various followers and generals and he was giving out big sections to everybody. And at one point, one of his supporters said to him, "But sire, if you give all of this away, what will you have for yourself?" And Alexander responds in very classic self mythologizing style, "Don't worry about me. All of Asia will be mine." Dun dun dun. So, yeah, he does that kind of thing. He's also, there's legends about his horse, for instance. Now, a lot of this was created after his death to describe why he was so successful. So imagine that. But there's all kinds of legends about Alexander. The one about his horse, Bucephalus, that's him there in the upper left pictured. The name means ox head, and I assume that was a reference to his temperament because he was described as an extremely fine and beautiful stallion. And he was bought by Philip when Alexander was a kid, a teenager, and he was brought to Macedon in order to improve the herds there, but he was too wild and nobody could ride him. And Alexander at one point shakes his head and is like, "Too bad that such a great horse is being wasted because no one is smart enough to ride him." And Philip is like, "What are you talking about? That's a dangerous horse there, son." And he's like, "Watch this." And so the legend goes that he had observed, because he was careful and clear-headed because he'd had all this philosophical training. He'd observed carefully and he'd noticed that the horse was shying away from his own shadow on the ground. And so what he does is he takes the horse and he turns it to look directly into the sun so he doesn't see a shadow. And then he leaps onto the back of Bucephalus and goes galloping around. And of course, a friendship is made forever. And Philip reflects on his son's genius and is like, I don't know what's going to happen. After I die, you're going to have to find some new land to conquer because Macedon won't be big enough for you. That's a kind of like after the fact legendizing that gets done. But that's part of the story. He's got his horse. He studies the Iliad. He models himself on the Homeric king. He fights in the front in battle. He hands out his loot very generously. He treats his followers with support. But sometimes that slips up. He models himself on this Homeric king, and his followers buy into this, very much so. They think of him as this great Achilles-like figure, somebody who honors his fellow warlords. And yet, once Alexander ends up in Persia and starts having successes, conquering cities that were nothing like the city-states of Greece, these are grand and glorious imperial palaces with courtiers and all of this diplomatic structure and bureaucratic structure, and you have all of these nobles who end up conquered and are trying to ingratiate themselves with this new guy in town. And so they do things like prostrate themselves, bow by lying on their bellies, because that's how you typically greet the king in their view. And so Alexander is not immune to flattery. He eats this up with a spoon. He's like, "Yes, that is great. You can call me the great king. That's fine." And some of his followers don't like it. They're like, your head is getting too big for your crown there. You're losing touch. You're forgetting who got you here." And there was one very famous interaction that reinforces this idea, where he was at a feast, Alexander, and one of his friends, Clytus, who'd come with him all the way from Macedon, and now they're in Persia. They'd recently fought some battles, they'd won some victories, which is why they're having this wonderful feast in this beautiful palace. But recently there'd been a skirmish or so that hadn't gone that well for the Greeks, and the entertainers who had come to keep Alexander amused were kind of poking fun at some of the Greek soldiers' lack of success. And Clytus leaps to his feet and shouts at Alexander, saying, "How can you let these lousy Persians make fun of Greeks? Have you forgotten who's gotten you here and who supports you and why you're in charge of this? And you think you're some kind of god king? And you know what happens to people who think they're gods? They get smacked down. Yeah, you're just insufferable, and I'm not putting up with this nonsense anymore, not appreciating me." And so Alexander becomes furious and he shouts back at him, and they have to be pulled apart by their various friends so they don't get into a fist fight in the middle of this banquet. And Clytus is dragged out, but then he comes running back in to shout at Alexander some more. Alexander picks up a knife or a sword, a blade of some kind, and throws it at his friend. And he strikes him in the chest and kills him dead. At this point, Alexander, who'd been very drunk during this entire experience, is absolutely crushed with guilt and remorse. What have I done? He was so shocked at his own behavior, at this loss of temper. He is deeply depressed, and he goes to his tent and he falls into this horrible, despondent kind of wallow of guilt. And his philosophers have to come actually and talk him out of it and be like, "No, no, no. We understand you feel really bad about this terrible lapse in your persona, but you have to come back and lead the army. We really need you." So Alexander is persuaded eventually to come back and take charge of things once more. He's also, this is the last panel on the bottom left there, famous for other sort of stories that get circulated about him at this point. One of them is the Gordian knot. There was this legend that whoever was able to untie this knot, it was tied around the axle of a chariot, and it was just so tight and you couldn't see the ends of it, and it was impossible to pull the thing apart. Whoever could untangle the Gordian knot would end up to be master of all Asia. And so Alexander goes and he looks at the knot. Everybody tried this. And he looks at it and he circles around and he looks at it and he thinks and he thinks and he looks. And then finally he pulls out his sword and whoosh, cuts right through it. And he's like, "Done. There you go." So Alexander is an out-of-the-box kind of thinker. Okay, so to make a long story short, battles are going to rage on, and Alexander's troops are going to have a great deal of success. The Persian army is very large, but they have a disadvantage against Alexander. Alexander moves very fast, especially his cavalry units. He also is able to make really effective use of the hoplite style armor, the long spears, and his general military discipline and practice. Alexander's troops are elite. The Persian forces, there's some political problems in Persia too, which we're not going to get into, but the Persian forces are really kind of ragtag. They're kind of pulled together from all different areas of the empire. They don't always have the best equipment. They don't always have any kind of like formalized training fighting together. They don't speak all the same languages. It's difficult. They weren't ready for this, and they were unprepared to meet the challenge that Alexander comes across. And it takes them longer than it should to really understand how much danger they're in. And so the Persian army rides out to meet Alexander on a number of occasions. Alexander gets the upper hand, and he just is a brilliant strategist. There's no getting around it. And in 333, there's a decisive battle, the Battle of Issus, where he's going to encounter Darius III, who is the king at this time of Persia, the emperor. And the battle is as decisive as it is because during this conflict, the baggage train of the Persians is separated from the main part of their army. Alexander's troops managed to cut it off. And this is a big deal because the baggage train contains all the food, supplies, replacement weapons, valuable loot that Darius really, really didn't want captured. Because Alexander had had so many successes up until this point, Darius felt insecure leaving anything he especially valued in any place. He was afraid of leaving it behind because he was afraid that Alexander would take over that territory and get hold of it. And so all the stuff he was really afraid to lose, he'd put in the baggage train of the army, thinking this would be the safest place for it because he has the whole army to protect it. And that's not illogical thinking. But what it meant was that all of his royal treasury, his wife, his daughters, and his mother were all in the baggage train when Alexander encounters them at the Battle of Issus. Darius himself has to flee the battlefield. That's what this mosaic from Pompeii, much later, it's a Roman period, depicts. That's Darius in the chariot looking sad, reaching his open hand backward. Alexander's on the horse way over on the left there, staring down Darius. And Darius has to flee the battlefield. He and his troops kind of run off and then try to reform elsewhere. But once he's off the field, he realizes to his dismay, his wife, his daughters, and his mother have fallen into the hands of Alexander the Great. And of course, the king of Persia is very upset by this, and he immediately sends a ransom offer to Alexander that says, "Hey, could just name your price. I'll pay whatever you want, but I would like my family returned to me." It is a little bit of like a replay out of that Iliad thing there. And in one way, Alexander's response is similar to Agamemnon because he sends a relatively rude answer back to Darius. He says, "I don't know what you think you have to offer me. Everything you once owned is already mine." But on the flip side, Alexander proves he's not like Agamemnon because instead of dishonoring the family of Darius, treating them like slave girls and generally gloating about it, he treats them with every respect. He has a beautiful, comfortable tent put up for them where he houses them that is right next to Alexander's own tent. Alexander will stop by and visit them when he has free time in between battles. He has chats. Apparently, he makes sure that they're safe and protected and well looked after. And he's so good at this, and he's so good at communicating his honorable intentions to the family of Darius that, according to legend, a little bit later, when Darius finally is killed in military action against Alexander, the messenger came running and goes into the tent of Darius's family and goes up to Darius's mother, the old queen of Persia, and says, "I have terrible, terrible news, Your Majesty. Your son is dead." And she looks at him straight in the eyes and says, "I don't know what you're talking about. I only have one son, and his name is Alexander." Ooh, that's harsh, man. But even if this happened, keep in mind that Alexander is the one person who is protecting and standing both in control and in the way of an unpleasant fate for Darius's family. So, at any rate, he is going to take good care of them. He's going to win, 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 win. Eventually, he has the only control over the Persian Empire. He's just the only one left standing. He has control over the whole thing. The various regional satraps are going to bow down to him and acknowledge him as the new king of Persia, in addition to all of his other titles and other victories. He's going to travel around. He's going to go to Egypt, where he'll be hailed as a pharaoh, as the god king. In fact, they're going to make statues of him that, pick up on that old story that his mom tried to tell, that he was actually the son of Zeus. Coins are going to be issued. If you can see this gold coin of Alexander, if you look closely, it looks like it might be a little curl of hair over his headband there, his crown. But in fact, you could see that that's a ram's horn, like a sheep. And this was a sign of divine parentage. Alexander hams this up, and this causes tension with his troops. They followed him thinking that they were following somebody who understood a Homeric style of king, who understood the lessons of the Iliad. Don't claim to be a god. Don't get too big for your britches. Value the people who put you where you are. And they're very uneasy about this, especially as Alexander puts forward new plans. He's like, okay, so next, I figure most of my generals are going to marry like Persian princesses, and that way the next generation of people are going to accept that we've taken over this region politically in a permanent way. And so he puts forward all these plans about marrying Persians and living in Persia, and his army starts getting more and more uncomfortable. They're like, okay, we went on this big Homeric style adventure thinking there'd be loot and exciting stuff to win, but we're a long way from home. I don't know if we wanted to do this whole Persia thing long term. So, in part to try to keep them from getting too restless, Alexander's like, okay, all right, fine, fine. We've conquered the Persian Empire. That was pretty easy, frankly, in the long grand scheme of things. What about if I can offer you even more glory and loot by conquering the rest of Asia? We'll just keep marching to the east. It'll be great. We'll conquer everything right up to the sea, wherever we find the sea. I'm not even certain that Alexander knew how far away it was, but he was going to conquer it. That was his plan. We'll just conquer everything, and the whole world will be ours, and it will be great. And so Alexander's army is not 100% certain they like this idea, but they're like, okay, fine. More glory, more conquest. This will be great. More loot. Yay. And so Alexander begins marching them to the east. And he takes a route more to the north of the Persian Empire, travels through the kingdom of Bactria, which you can see all the way kind of to the east and the north of the Persian Empire, where he is finally going to marry, well, not finally, but he decides, he takes some time out of his busy schedule to get married to a princess named Roxana, in 331 BC. And so he's on campaign, he's got his new wife, and he finally eventually gets to the borders of the Persian Empire, which took a little time. Once he gets there, though, he has to move to the south to go up against what is now kind of roughly India, the border with India there. And he has to do that because if he tries to keep marching kind of level with Bactria there, he hits the Himalayas, and he's not going through that. So he moves to the south to encounter the Nanda Empire in what is now India. And this is where Alexander starts getting into real trouble. Up until this point, he defeated kind of the centralized army of a relatively decentralized country. Persia had never really been a place that was strongly united in a kind of nationalist kind of way. The various regions of Persia, they paid their taxes, they kept public order, they supplied some guys for the army, but they didn't change their languages or religious practice or generally really feel themselves to be strongly Persian fighting off an invader. They're like, oh, well, the guy at the top seems to have changed, but nothing about my life will, so we don't really care. Once he starts getting to the border, however, he encounters border lords who have been fighting to keep this territory for some time. They're organized, they're tough, and they have a piece of military technology he was not prepared for. Now, Alexander's success, a good deal of it, came about through his innovative use of cavalry. And cavalry is a fantastic advantage to have. Horses are fast, they're strong, they can move and maneuver you in ways that people on foot can't in terms of speed and flexibility. They can provide support for your infantry. They are a great piece of military technology, if you want to think of them that way. And a well trained horse is a fighter in his own right. They bite, they kick, and they're just with the sheer bulk of them and the sort of sharp, heavy hooves, they can be very dangerous to your enemies. However, the problem with a horse as a war partner or a piece of military technology is that they are alive. And they do think, they are thinking creatures, and they therefore always have a certain amount of veto power over whatever your plan is. And when they encountered the cutting edge of Indian military technology, they decided to exercise that veto power. Because what Alexander encounters on the border is the war elephant. This was something he was not at all prepared to deal with. And it was certainly something his horses were not at all prepared to deal with. And they did a big, nope, we don't think so, when they had to run into elephants. Also, the hoplite phalanx, that mainstay of Greek fighting technology that works so well against other infantry, other people fighting on foot, does not work well at all against elephants. I mean, yes, you can stab elephants with spears. Elephants' hides are very tough. They're hard to really hurt very. I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to bring down an elephant. It's really difficult to bring down a lot of elephants. And if your whole military strategy revolves around holding your place, it's staying in tight formation, an elephant is your biggest nightmare because they literally just trample and smash people aside. And there's nothing you can do about it. There is no holding the line against an elephant. It just isn't going to be done. So this is a challenge Alexander wasn't ready for, and it causes him to have to re-examine his entire strategy. The battles that take place on the borders become really hard fought, miserable, high casualty battles, where Alexander does get the upper hand in a few of them, but this is nothing like the easy fighting he was anticipating. It's nasty, it's drawn out, and then the weather starts to turn. There's a monsoon season. And his troops eventually just have had enough. They're like, you know what, Alexander? We are years and so many miles from where we started. We went on this thinking we'd have an adventure, get a lot of loot, and go back home to Macedon and Greece. We don't want to do this anymore. And so what happens to Alexander on the borders of India is that his troops basically mutiny. They refuse. They're like, we're not doing this anymore. We'll just rebel against you. We are not going to fight this. We're just done. We're done. We're not getting trampled by any more elephants. And so Alexander eventually reluctantly is like, fine, whatever, we'll go back. And so he begins the retreat. And some of his troops he loads onto ships and is going to sail them basically back to the sort of heartland of the Persian Empire. But others, he is going to march. He doesn't really have a choice. He doesn't have enough ships to load everybody onto them, or he would have. The rest he's going to march, but rather than going back the way he came, northward through Bactria, where his wife is from, he's going to decide that he wants to march a southern route along the coast through a region known as Gedrosia. And he wants to do this in part because he's trying to salvage some glory from this campaign, and nobody has ever marched an army through Gedrosia before. There's a reason for that, as it turns out. It's because Gedrosia looks like this. It's a horrifying, from the perspective of a marching army, desert. And that stuff you see that's white there is not snow, that is salt in this particular instance. There's no water, there's no food. His army is exhausted. They've been fighting very hard, and about a third of them are going to die from exposure, exhaustion, and thirst on this march. They're going to get sick. It is just awful. Alexander himself gets sick on the march through Gedrosia. He does survive, but the whole thing is a disaster. The army goes limping back into the Persian heartland. Alexander does survive that long, but he at this point is weakened. He's had several injuries during his various fighting at the front in battle experiences. He survived Gedrosia by the skin of his teeth, but it was demoralizing and it was hard, and he gets very sick. By the time he gets back, he doesn't have much longer for the world. In 323 BC, he is going to die. He's going to get back to Susa, so he makes it all the way back to the heartland of Persia. And then he's going to take to his deathbed. He dies of an illness. There were rumors at the time he was poisoned, but that's almost certainly not true. He dies of illness. He leaves behind himself a pregnant wife, Roxanne. She's pregnant but hasn't given birth yet. There's no clear successor, no heir to logically come after him. Even his unborn son is, he's unborn. And even if he were born, a baby can't take over the empire. There has to be a regent. There has to be somebody in charge. And so there's nobody clearly in charge. And so Alexander's lying on his deathbed dying. And his generals, his war leaders, all gather around him and they ask him, this is the legend of Alexander, who do you leave your empire to? And according to legend, Alexander looks around at them and says, I leave it to the strongest. Bleh. And then he dies.